The president declares this was an act of war.
The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy.
But who is the enemy?
Our government has credible evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targets.
Tonight, the latest on the hunt for clues and the desperate, heroic search for victims of the attack on America. The nation is stunned but standing this day after the attack and vowing to come back, fight back. Good evening again from CBS News headquarters in New York. Dan Rather with a special edition of the CBS Evening News, continuing coverage of the attack on America. It is not a declared war, but a war just the same. The word President Bush is now using to describe these suicide plane strikes on the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. And the stakes could not be higher. A White House spokesman says intended targets included the White House and Air Force One. Read that, the President of the United States, since it is only Air Force One if he is aboard. The U.S. Justice Department says some of the skyjackers were trained as pilots in the United States. In an unprecedented move, NATO said terror attacks against the United States will be considered attacks against the entire alliance. And the stock market will be closed again tomorrow. It could be open Friday, they say Monday at the very latest. Here are some of today's other key developments. Rescue teams are working round the clock in the rubble of the World Trade Towers, risking their lives, trying to find victims of the disaster. President Bush said the attacks were not just acts of terror, they were acts of war, a war he vowed we will win. New polls indicate there's widespread American public support for retaliation. Congress reconvened today in a public show of unity to condemn the attack on the United States. Air travel was grounded for a second day as airlines prepared to resume some flying under strict new security. The U.S. financial markets were closed again, but the United States and our allies vowed that these acts of terror will not destabilize the world economy. Federal investigators are following hundreds of leads tonight to try to find out who was behind the attacks and bring them to justice. Some aspects of the disaster go on. Take a look at this picture. Just a short time ago, another of the buildings damaged in the attack on the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan finally surrendered in a kind of slow-motion collapse. The building apparently was damaged by the collapse of the nearby Twin Towers. Also today, the last standing portion of the South Tower collapsed. Now to one of the headline stories of this day, the White House saying that President Bush apparently was an intended target of the terrorists. CBS's John Roberts is at the White House tonight. John?
Dan, as a further explanation as to why the president traveled all the way to Nebraska before heading back to Washington late yesterday, officials today revealed that they had a specific and credible threat against the president's life aboard Air Force One. And the president's press secretary went even further today, saying they have every reason to believe that the White House was a prime target of yesterday's massive terrorist attacks.
We have real and credible information that the airplane that landed at the Pentagon was originally intended to hit the White House.
White House officials would not disclose what evidence they had, but said today they believe the aircraft was streaking toward the president's home before terrorists suddenly circled back to hit the Pentagon. The threat against Air Force One was learned shortly after President Bush took off from Sarasota, Florida yesterday, intending to return to Washington. At that time, 9:55 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, which eventually crashed near Pittsburgh, was still in the air. Press flying aboard Air Force One said what appeared to be an urgent return to Andrews Air Force Base suddenly changed.
Somewhere about 20 minutes into the flight, just as the Atlantic Ocean came into view off the right wing, we suddenly veered left, banked left, and started climbing in altitude, eventually leveling out at about 40,000 feet.
As Air Force One veered toward Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, word passed among security personnel on board that one hijacked aircraft still hadn't been accounted for. This afternoon, the strong suggestion from the White House that the target was Andrews Air Force Base the moment the president touched down.
It would be wise and in the interest of the country for Air Force One not to return to a location that would have been predictable.
Now, late this afternoon, White House officials said that the president's strong language this morning that these were not just acts of terror, they were acts of war, had no bearing on the threat against his life. They said that attacks on American soil, such as the attack against the Pentagon, that the president toured late this afternoon, thanking the rescue workers who were involved in the search and rescue and salvage operations, such as the attack against the Pentagon. As for any declaration of war against those who might be responsible, the White House said late today that the president will work together with Congress to take the appropriate action at the appropriate time. Dan?
John, do most indicators, so far as you can make out, still point to Osama bin Laden, perhaps Osama bin Laden plus, but is the main focus in the investigation increasingly on bin Laden and Afghanistan or not?
Well, Dan, certainly no one is mentioning any other names but that of Osama bin Laden at this point, though sources still caution us that not all of that information is sewn together. They do not have a definite link. But, Dan, what you can certainly see in the president's language today, as well as the language of the Secretary of State, the White House does appear to be steeling the people of this nation for some sort of appropriate response at, again, what the president says will be the appropriate time.
John Roberts, thanks. It now appears some doomed passengers and crew aboard the hijacked planes may have made desperate efforts to save their lives and engaged in heroic acts against the skyjackers. CBS's Bob Orr has been collecting the astounding information coming out on this front and has some late details. Bob?
Well, Dan, tonight there is some new evidence that authorities were given a last-minute warning just before yesterday's attack. And as you mentioned, it may turn out the hostages on at least one of the planes tried to overpower their hijackers. But in the end, there was no way to stop the wholesale destruction.
Sources say shortly before American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the World Trade Center, a crew member aboard the jetliner managed to phone the airline's operations center with a hijacking alert. In addition, the Christian Science Monitor reports one of the jet's pilots secretly keyed a cockpit microphone, allowing controllers to hear the terrorist threats. But there was no time to stop the attack and no way to keep the second jet, United Airlines Flight 175, from delivering the follow-up blast. There is new evidence hijackers made some effort to conceal that attack. As this Flight Explorer display demonstrates, crucial radar data suddenly dropped off controller screens as Flight 175 made its final turn over New Jersey. As it closed in on Manhattan, controllers had no way of knowing exactly where the plane was. Sources say that's because someone in the cockpit, presumably a hijacker familiar with cockpit controls, deliberately turned off the plane's transponder, the device that sends flight information to controllers. The transponder on American Flight 77 was also turned off before that jet crashed into the Pentagon. Radar tracked the 757 to the Ohio-Kentucky border, but information was lost as the plane turned and targeted Washington. Sources say the jet seemed to be on a track towards the White House, but suddenly headed for the Pentagon. CBS News consultant Mitch Mitchell was right there.
We watched it go in front of us at a distance of about 100 feet in front of us and about 20 feet over us. It appeared as if we were landing right on our roof. We looked, we watched it go into the Pentagon.
The fourth airplane did not hit its designated target, but crashed in rural Pennsylvania. At least one cell phone call from a passenger indicated there was a plan to take on the hijackers. And sources say there is some evidence of a fight for control just before the plane went down. Alice Hoagland also got a call from her son on that doomed plane. Mark Bingham told her of 3 hijackers claiming to have a bomb.
I asked him, Mark, who are these people? And he became distracted, didn't answer the question, and then we were cut off.
We're told 10 to 12 minutes after that phone call, that plane, United Flight 93, crashed. Investigators say they hope the flight recorders will tell them exactly what went on in that cockpit, but more importantly, perhaps, who was behind the well-orchestrated attack. Dan?
And on that score, Bob, FBI Director Robert Mueller today stressed there are 2 immediate goals: identify the hijackers, the killers, and any accomplices inside or outside the United States. CBS's Jim Stewart reports investigators already know a lot. Jim, what do they know?
Dan, as many as 24 terrorists armed with knives seized the hijacked aircraft, and federal authorities now say they know many of them by name and that all of them learned how to fly commercial aircraft right here in the United States. Sources say the identities surfaced through a study of the passenger manifest from the doomed aircraft, plus communications intercepts picked up shortly after the attacks. And while the evidence is still in the early stages, sources say all of it still points like a compass to Osama bin Laden.
Attorney General John Ashcroft provided the first official details of what happened on board the planes.
The 4 planes were hijacked by between 3 and 6 individuals per plane, using knives and box cutters, and in some cases making bomb threats.
New FBI Director Bob Mueller said after identifying all the hijackers, his next step is to retrace their steps.
And we are attempting to recreate the travels of each of the hijackers on the planes, either the hijackers themselves or their associates.
Back up! And the search for those associates was in full fury today, with FBI SWAT teams storming a Boston hotel to search a room believed used by one or more of the hijackers. No one connected with the hijackings was arrested there or later when authorities stopped a train near Providence, Rhode Island. Officials were also focusing on 2 aviation schools in Florida and appeared to zero in on 2 recent Arab students. Residents say agents specifically asked about a man named Mohammed Atta and another named Marwan Yusuf Al-Shihi, both of whom had their commercial pilot multi-engine licenses recertified in June. Venice, Florida resident Charles Voss said he told agents he rented a room to the 2 men a year ago.
Well, they told me that that these 2 persons were involved, and it was believed that they were some of the individuals that had been involved in the takeover of the aircraft that went into the World Trade Center.
Elsewhere, agents conducted searches in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, Daytona, and Vero Beach, Florida, as well as along entry points at the Canadian border adjoining Maine, where 2 of the suspects may have entered the United States. And, of course, investigators were still collecting all the usual physical evidence.
Rental car receipts, telephone logs, videotape from parking garages, and pay telephone videotape records.
The clear assumption by federal lawmen is that these terrorists had help from accomplices who may still be in the United States. What is not as clear is whether those accomplices were only bit players in this historic assault, or whether they may still have still-to-be-launched terrorist plans of their own. Dan?
Jim, is it expected or not that there soon will be some arrests?
Dan, I do sense optimism in talking with federal authorities, but I have to tell you that if this does turn out to be Osama bin Laden, then we have been down this path before. First national outrage, then a flurry of search warrants and record gathering, followed by months of frustration. We can only hope that this one especially, turns out to be different. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. Even as the fires from the attack on the Pentagon flared up and still burned today, planning was going forward for a possible military response against those behind the terror. CBS's David Martin is tracking both stories. David?
Dan, the Pentagon may not have been the primary target, but the plane certainly scored a direct hit. Defense Department officials say there are no more survivors. Anyone not killed by the impact perished in the flames. It now appears between 100 and 200 people died here, but not the 800 one official had estimated.
And we won't know for some time precise numbers, but from everything that we currently know, the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high.
Some of the 60 survivors are being treated for severe burns, and their relatives count them lucky to be alive.
I walked in there and I said, "I love you." She moved her head a little bit. I said, "Please wiggle your toes." Her toes wiggled, and that was the extent of our conversation. I was so ecstatic.
When the sun came up this morning, firefighters were still pouring water on the blaze started by the jet fuel.
We are still engaged in a very stubborn firefight with parts of the building.
The wife of an Army accountant who worked right where the plane hit could do nothing but keep a hopeless vigil.
Obviously, the fire is still pretty much going, but it's still frustrating to see them just kind of looking at it and not going in.
By mid-afternoon, the smoke had finally cleared. Now it's the FBI's turn because the wreckage is considered a crime scene, although the force of the crash destroyed much of the evidence.
There are some small pieces of aircraft visible, but not large sections. In other words, there's no fuselage sections and that sort of thing.
Parts of the Pentagon are open, although heavily guarded, as are all U.S. military bases. Not knowing for sure if the attacks are over, the Pentagon has ordered fighters to patrol both the east and west coasts and is sending warships to both New York and Washington. But the most valuable ship may be the hospital ship Comfort. The investigation into who caused all this continues to point toward Osama bin Laden, and there's no doubt the U.S. will retaliate against whoever is responsible, as the Secretary of Defense made clear in an address to the troops.
The task of vanquishing these terrible enemies and in protecting the American people and the cause of human freedom will fall to you, the men and women in the Department of Defense.
The aircraft carrier Enterprise has been turned around and sent back to the Persian Gulf, giving the U.S. 2 carrier battle groups in the region. It's clear the Bush administration is planning for an all-out military campaign against terrorism.
I think anyone who thinks it's easy is wrong. I think that it will require a sustained and broadly based effort.
The European allies today invoked the clause of the NATO treaty, which states that an attack against one is an attack against all. The more allies the U.S. gathers up, the more military options it has.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world.
Osama bin Laden is believed to be hiding out in Afghanistan, which is why U.S. officials have begun talks with Pakistan, which shares a long border with Afghanistan. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. In Afghanistan today, Osama bin Laden's Taliban protectors insisted again, but offered no evidence, that bin Laden had nothing to do with the attacks. At the same time, the Taliban made what could be interpreted as a threat, suggesting that U.S. military action that causes what they call suffering in Afghanistan might lead to more suicide attacks. While officials hold out no hope for finding survivors in the Pentagon attack, a massive effort is still underway here in New York. Workers are braving dust, danger, and more unstable buildings, trying to find thousands of missing people in the Trade Center rubble. CBS's Byron Pitts is at the scene tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, here at Ground Zero, there has now been a shift in the mood and the wind. In the past half hour, the wind has turned north. That means the plumes of smoke over the disaster site that you see behind me are now headed in our direction. That gas is filled with dangerous gases and fibers. And for that reason, authorities have recommended that we wear these respirators for our own safety. Also, a few minutes ago, a firefighter came out and told us all that they no longer hear those tapping sounds coming from the debris. No more cell phone calls. No more radio messages from police officers and firefighters buried in the debris. Not a good sign of what has already been a very difficult day. Today, in the long shadow of Lady Liberty, as Air Force fighter jets patrol the skies over Manhattan, volunteers by the thousands sifted through metal and misery.
One of the officers came in and said they found a man at 6 in the morning and they had to cut his legs to get him out.
All reminders freedom in America has never been free.
I'm doing this because this is America, this is New York, and these people need people down there right now. I know if I was in there, they'd be in there trying to dig me out.
I was at Oklahoma City bombing the Murray building. This is like 20 of them all in one.
Rescuer and police officer Dan McDonough says he isn't simply looking for survivors or bodies. He, like so many others, is still looking for friends.
We're missing our whole company.
New York's fire chief, a senior chaplain, and head of the search and rescue team, all killed when a building collapsed. More than 200 fellow firefighters missing. Close to 30 New York City police officers unaccounted for. And there, beneath 50 feet of twisted steel and crumpled concrete, beneath what were once the tallest towers in Manhattan, rest the remains of countless victims and the whispers of survivors still alive.
We were taking out someone on a stretcher.
They were alive.
And as he came down the line, I saw that his eyes were open and he was talking.
How good did that feel?
I'm almost ready to cry once again.
But there is not a single chance the living here will outnumber the dead.
The numbers that we're working on are in the thousands. Obviously, we hope that's not the case.
There are men and women lined up here who haven't slept much in the past 36 hours, running on adrenaline and running out of time. 8:48 a.m. Tuesday, that moment in time that changed lives and took lives.
horrible, horrible. The whole building just collapsed on us.
When we get you into Stuyvesant High School. Nightmares. Armageddon right here. I'm okay. I'm okay. It collapsed. The top floors collapsed down.
There was like a sonic boom and a firestorm above my head.
Kathy Capsuto ran from the World Trade Center with her daughters in her arms.
What do you tell your children after living through something like that?
I thank God that you're alive. And my kids know that their lives will never be the same again.
Never the same, but still New Yorkers tried. Blocks from the bombing, a father played ball with his son.
We're trying to make the kids adjust as much as possible without making them as afraid as the adults are.
That firefighter who came out and spoke with us a few minutes ago said that he, too, now is afraid. In the past hour, 3 more buildings collapsed, we've been told, around the disaster site. When that happened, the rescue workers were pulled out. That firefighter told us the longer he's unable to do his job, the less likely it becomes they will find more survivors. Dan, many people will pray tonight that firefighter is wrong.
Byron Pitts. The word came late today from Wall Street, only blocks from the lower Manhattan disaster site. The stock markets will be closed again tomorrow and possibly the rest of this week. CBS's business correspondent Anthony Mason tells us what this may mean. Anthony?
Dan, the bond market will reopen tomorrow, but concerned about the damage to infrastructure, much of Wall Street will not go back to business. The stock markets will remain closed for a 3rd straight day because, as the head of the SEC, Harvey Pitt, put it, we didn't want to promise something we couldn't deliver.
Drowned in debris, Wall Street was a deserted corridor again today. The head of the New York Stock Exchange could promise only that markets
will resume operations no later than Monday.
Dick Grasso said Wall Street still had concerns about the soundness of structures, access to buildings, and power supply.
The conduits that sit beneath the streets of lower Manhattan have been subjected to the equivalent of several mini earthquakes when those 2 towers came down.
Many major financial firms had their offices damaged or destroyed in the attack, but the damage to physical capital was only part of the story.
I worry a little bit more about the human capital, the expertise that was probably lost. You know, we can rebuild a building and install computer screens, but to train the kind of people who were probably lost there yesterday, that will take some time.
The investment firm Morgan Stanley had 3,500 employees in the World Trade Center. Today, on its Times Square ticker, instead of stock quotes, the company ran employee helpline numbers. CEO Philip Purcell said this morning the vast majority were safe.
It is not a good story, but we think it's going to be much less bad than it appeared during the day yesterday.
But in a broadcast to his employees, he appeared to choke up.
And we're going to be fine.
But will the U.S. economy be fine? World markets have been highly volatile in the aftermath of the attack, amid concerns about the country that has been the engine of the global economy.
I think there's a lot of caution amongst investors around the world now as they try to understand just how much the U.S. public, how much that engine of growth could have been knocked off its track.
One encouraging sign, the European markets rebounded today, and the finance ministers and central bankers of the Group of 7 nations issued a joint statement vowing the global economy will not be disrupted. Dan?
Anthony, with all of the damage to the buildings and this scene down in lower Manhattan, how can these companies reopen for business by even Monday?
One of the remarkable things is almost all of these major companies have entire duplicate systems, sometimes as far away as Virginia, across the river in New Jersey. There are secondary trading floors just sitting empty waiting for a crisis. They're just moving people to those places. All of your financial records, whichever company may have it, has a duplicate set somewhere else in the country. They can retrieve that information.
Anthony Mason, thanks. For the insurance industry, claims from the terror attack on the World Trade Center could reach a near-record $15 billion. That would make it second only to the $20 billion insurance bill from 1992's Hurricane Andrew. Joining us now from Washington, the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Democrat Tom Daschle of South Dakota. Mr. Leader, thank you for coming in tonight.
You're welcome, Dan.
True or untrue that your hope and the hope of your Republican counterparts is that you can pass a $20 billion appropriations bill to handle some of the cost of what's happening now by late tomorrow?
Well, Dan, I think it's premature to come to any conclusions about what the amount or how quickly the passage, but we certainly want to act as expeditiously as we can. We've been in close consultation with the White House and with our colleagues in the House of Representatives, and we'll do whatever it takes to be as helpful and as cooperative as possible.
What is the effect of this on our economy? We pull back what we call in television the wide shot. Yes, we're very much concerned about the families of victims and the search for what may remain of the living, but at some point we have to say, what's happening with our economy? Is this enough to tip us over into recession?
Well, I think your story just now reflects the tremendous devastation and the concern for the economy. We want to do all that we can to help stabilize it through policy and through our public pronunciations. But clearly we know we're in some very difficult times. We know that there is a good deal of uncertainty, whether we open the markets on Monday or sometime this week. We know that we've got our work cut out for us, and we also know that we have a responsibility to try to put as much confidence back into the economy and into the markets as we can.
As for the investigation into who is responsible for what's been happening, you've been briefed. What do you hear? What can you tell us?
Well, there's little that we can tell you beyond what has already been reported. We do know that the full force of all of our investigative agencies, all of our intelligence agencies are now being applied. We recognize that there is a good deal of work that needs to be done. We also recognize that there's a lot we probably won't know for some time to come, that we've got to collectively and very carefully put together the pieces so we have the best understanding of what the circumstances are that we could hope to have.
And a retaliation of some kind is likely to happen sooner as opposed to later, larger as opposed to smaller?
Well, I don't know that we want to put a timeline on it or a size on it. We know that we're going to do all that will be required to punish the perpetrators, to bring to justice those responsible, to retaliate wherever it is possible for us to do so with the confidence that we're retaliating in the right way. But clearly this is going to take additional fact-gathering, additional intelligence, and far more effort to try to put a plan in place prior to the time we commit to that plan.
In Congress, is there generally satisfaction with our intelligence operations, despite the fact that there was no warning of these attacks?
Well, I'd say there is a general level of satisfaction. Clearly, these acts of terror cannot be predicted with any certainty. I think the intelligence gathering services of the federal government have done a good job. We know now, given the threat, given the circumstances, given what we now recognize as a new era, we're going to have to do a lot more. And we want to be supportive of efforts to do more as we look to what resources they may need.
Mr. Leader, let's turn to what is now the transportation emergency. What's your information on when the airlines will be back to anywhere near normal?
Well, I don't know when we'll be near normal. We are going to restart all of at least the commercial airline traffic tomorrow morning. That doesn't mean that things will be back the way they were even on Monday. We are going to go through a lot more security. We're going to have much more of a cautionary approach to the way in which our airlines are scheduled. But clearly the effort will begin tomorrow. There will be bumps. There will be a lot of glitches. We know that this isn't going to be smooth. We've got to brace ourselves for that, but it starts tomorrow.
Mr. Leader, is legislation being considered to make law enforcement in charge of the security at our airports?
Well, we're considering a lot of legislative options regarding Social Security, or regarding security, Dan, and that's one of them. What can we do to beef up security in ways that will give us more confidence? I think we've now seen a tremendous threat to air travel in ways that we never anticipated. We've got to recognize that that will require actions that we never anticipated, and we're contemplating just what those actions should be.
Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, thank you.
My pleasure.
You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Now, the situation in Lower Manhattan at the moment is the death toll continues to rise, but slowly, because the rescue and recovery efforts are being so hampered. This is CBS News, ongoing coverage of the attack on America. Back now at CBS News World Headquarters.